Hey everybody, how's it going? Okay, let me just get this set up here. Okay, so for those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter. Today I'd like to talk about the first 3 chapters in the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel is just, I really think, one of the most powerful books of the Bible, and I highly encourage anyone to find the time to read or reread this book. Today we're going to talk about a story of people trying to remain faithful to God in an empire that forces values on its people that are very counter to God's wisdom. The story explains how God's people can learn to live in the tension between doing what is good for their society while never abandoning God and his ways. I believe it's really relevant for Christians today. So our story begins in chapter 1 with Jerusalem becoming besieged by Babylon. Verse 1 reads, "During the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple." So that's kind of what you might normally expect a conquering king to do, is just to take some shiny stuff from the temple. But we learn he does something a step further than that. He commands his people, quote, to select strong, healthy, and handsome, good-looking young men, make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning and are gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these men in the language of literature of Babylon. The goal of this is to recruit not only just skilled men from the land you conquer to serve in your empire, it also seeks a goal of indoctrinating these men into Babylonian culture, to make them Babylonian, so that they might return to their home provinces one day and administer those regions while increasing the authority and the power of Babylon. If we move on to the next slide, we can see a map here that kind of gives us an approximation of what their journey must have looked like. You can see that they can't just make a straight shot from Jerusalem to Babylon. They need to go the long way around. We can estimate that this journey is roughly 1,700 miles. To put that in perspective, that's about the same distance it would take you to drive from this church to Vancouver, Canada. So that's a pretty long way to go by cart. The narrative goes on to indicate in verses 6 and 7 that Daniel and his companions, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, were among those taken captive into Babylon. And as part of their indoctrination to the culture, they're given new names of Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So it's a little confusing because we're going to be referring to these people by multiple different names throughout the story, but you got to remember they've got their names from Jerusalem and also their names in Babylon. So moving on to the next slide, we can see, if you find yourself in exile, in captivity, you might be presented with 2 different paths. Well, I can just go to the left and surrender, abandoning our Jewish heritage and just embrace life as a Babylonian. I don't want to cause any fuss. I don't want to get in trouble or just have a difficult life for my family. Then in the other extreme, you could imagine war, where you need to resist Babylon by any means necessary and fight until you regain your freedom. Well, as usual in the Bible, things aren't quite this simple. If we move on, we can see that there is a 3rd path that you need to walk, and that is the path of faithfulness. It's described in the book of Jeremiah in chapter 29, where they are expected to work dutifully for Babylon, to build houses, to pray for the well-being of Babylon, because that means the well-being of the captives, while at the same time never losing your identity in God. As you can imagine, this is a pretty difficult tightrope to walk, balancing yourself between these 2 extremes. And we're going to see our heroes in this story attempt to do that. Moving on to the next slide, we can see that the beginning of their Babylonian training involves being served daily rations from the king's kitchen. That may seem pretty generous. I imagine the king, he eats some pretty decent food. But it actually serves a more sinister purpose. It's to try and get them indoctrinated into the lifestyle and the privilege of being Babylonian. I also think it could kind of serve to almost engender a sense of Stockholm syndrome, where the captives become grateful and more loyal to their captors, which would cause them to serve the empire more loyalty. This food presents a major challenge to our heroes. They know it would be dishonoring God to abandon their dietary laws that they were given. So, instead, Daniel chooses to request to eat a simple diet of vegetables and water. We see in verse 10 how the chief of staff of King Nebuchadnezzar responds to this request. "I am afraid the Lord my king, who has ordered you to eat this food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded." Okay, that's not a normal response to someone asking to eat vegetables. And I think it kind of gives us an impression about what life is like in Babylon. They're not just captives of someplace far away, like Canada or something. They're being held in captives in a place that is extremely dangerous, where you could get killed for seemingly the smallest infractions. I personally have to imagine that there's a good chance the chief of staff, he's not being paranoid. He only got promoted to chief of staff because he saw what happened to the last guy. So what do you do in this situation? Well, in verse 12, Daniel responds to the chief of staff by saying, "Please test us for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water. At the end of those 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Then make your decision in light of what you see." Daniel, he doesn't take the easy path of surrender and saying, "Okay, I don't want to anger this guy and get in trouble here. I'll just eat the food." But he also doesn't choose a path of resistance and say, "Well, guess what? I'm going to go on a hunger strike until you give me the food I want." He walks that path of faithfulness, and he's able to trust that even just 10 days, God is going to prove his power and love for them. In verse 15 on the next slide, we learn that, quote, "At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his friends were looking better and healthier, more nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned to the king." God actually goes above and beyond giving them healthy-looking appearances. In verse 17, that we learn that God gives Daniel and all four of them an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. Daniel even receives the ability to interpret dreams, which, as we see, is going to come in pretty handy. Moving on to the next slide, we can see that the story continues with King Nebuchadnezzar having a dream that greatly disturbs him. Chapter 2 starts out by stating, "One night during the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had such a disturbing dream that he couldn't sleep. He called all the magicians, enchanters, sorcerers, and astrologers, and he demanded that they tell him what the dream means. As they stood before the king, he said, 'I have had a dream that deeply troubles me, and I must know what it means.' The astrologers reasonably respond by saying, 'Hey, let us know what the dream is, so we might interpret it,' but King Nebuchadnezzar isn't having that. He says in verse 5 and 6, 'I'm serious about this. If you don't tell me what my dream means, what it was and what it means, you will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. But if you tell me what the dream means, I will give you many wonderful gifts and honors. Just tell me what it means.' The king is clearly deeply concerned about this dream, and I think he knows if I just tell these wise men and astrologers what the dream is, they'll come up with some kind of answer that sounds good. But I don't want that. I want them to not only tell me what the dream means, but to tell me what the dream is, so I can be extra certain that what you're saying is correct." And once again, we get an insight into how King Nebuchadnezzar values human lives. Instead of, simply firing or maybe imprisoning the magicians who failed to fulfill his order, King Nebuchadnezzar promises them a pretty gruesome death and destruction upon their families. Moving on, the astrologers explain that they are unable to meet the king's demand. They state that no one except the gods could possibly complete this task. Verse 12 states that the king was furious when he heard this, and he ordered that all of the wise men of Babylon be executed. And because of the king's decree, men were sent to find and kill Daniel and his friends. So I think at first we kind of thought, wow, killing all the astrologers, that's pretty extreme. But just because he was upset, King Nebuchadnezzar, he ups the ante, and he says, all wise men are going to be killed, even people who have nothing to do with this dream or never even claimed to have the ability to interpret dreams. This results in Daniel and his friends being sentenced to death despite having nothing to do with this. I think this is pretty shocking. This is a level of indiscriminate violence that I think is really only matched in modern history by the purges of Joseph Stalin or some other kind of dictator like that. When one of the king's commanders arrived to kill Daniel and his friends, Daniel doesn't respond by saying, well, I better kill them before they kill me. He doesn't also respond by pleading for his life or running away. Instead, he responds by walking the path of faithfulness. He trusts in God's mercy and actually seeks to help the very king, the very dictator, who just ordered his execution. Verses 17 and 18 state, then Daniel went home and told his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, what had happened. He had urged them to ask the God of heaven to show them his mercy by telling them the secret, so he would not be executed along with the other wise men of Babylon. When God reveals the dream to Daniel, he immediately offers a prayer of praise, and I have to imagine that the relief he felt in that moment was immense. Daniel then goes on to meet with the commander and request an audience with the king so that he might tell him what the dream means. After God revealed the vision to Daniel and its meaning, he went before King Nebuchadnezzar and said, quote, in your vision, your majesty, you were standing before a huge statue of a man. It was a frightening sight. The head of the statue was made of fine gold. Its chest and arms were silver. Its belly and its thighs were bronze. Its legs were iron, and its feet were a combination of iron and baked clay. As you watched, a rock was cut from the mountain, but not by human hands. It struck the feet of iron and clay, smashing them to bits. This whole statue was crushed into small pieces of iron, clay, bronze, silver, and gold. Then the wind blew them away without a trace, like chaff on the threshing floor. But the rock that knocked the statue down became a great mountain that covered the whole earth. Your majesty, you are the greatest of kings. The God of heaven has given you sovereignty, power, strength, and honor. He has made you ruler over all the inhabited world and even put the wild animals and birds under your control. You are the head of gold. But your kingdom comes to an end. Another kingdom, inferior to yours, will rise and take your place. And after that kingdom has fallen, yet a third kingdom, represented by bronze, will rise to rule the world. Following that kingdom, there will be a fourth one, strong as iron. This kingdom will smash and crush all previous empires, just as iron smashes and crushes everything it strikes. The feet and toes you saw were a combination of iron and baked clay, showing that this kingdom will be divided, like iron mixed with clay. It will have some of the strength of iron, but while some parts of it will be as strong as iron, other parts will be as weak as clay. This mixture of iron and clay shows that these kingdoms will try to strengthen themselves by forming alliances with each other through intermarriage, but they will not hold us together, just as iron and clay do not mix. During the reign of all those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed or conquered. It will crush all the kingdoms into nothingness, and it will stand forever. This is the meaning the rock cut from the mountain. Though not by human hands, it will be crushed by pieces of the statue of iron, bronze, clay, and silver. The great God was showing the king what will happen in the future. The dream is true, and its meaning is certain. I think Daniel just revealed some pretty bad news to King Nebuchadnezzar. You know, I might be pretty tempted in that situation to say, okay, thank you, God, for letting me know what that dream is, but this guy's kind of crazy. I'm going to sugarcoat it a little bit so I don't get in trouble. But Daniel doesn't do that. He tells them exactly what it means, seeking the welfare of King Nebuchadnezzar, giving him correct information, and he trusts in God. Well, this is pretty terrible news for King Nebuchadnezzar. I have to imagine it's pretty great relief for the other exiles. They are being held captive by the most powerful empire in the world at this time, yet they just received a reminder from God, who is far more powerful than any empire on earth, and that he will not abandon them. Daniel is once again rewarded for his faithfulness. The king, though, actually worships Daniel instead of his God, but he seems to grant Daniel even more authority. Moving on, after learning from the meaning of the dream, it's a gold statue representing... So Nebuchadnezzar, he just learned, I had a dream where a gold statue representing my kingdom is going to be destroyed. His first response to that is to say, hey, it'd be pretty great if I built a gold statue representing my kingdom. Verse 1 states that King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. I don't know, we could say that this building is roughly 30 feet tall. So, I want us to try and imagine a statue that is 3 times bigger than this building. That's a pretty big statue. And we learn what the stakes are about this statue that comes with it in verses 4 through 6. People of all races and nations and language, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, harps, pipes, and other musical instruments, bow down to the ground and worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be blown into a blazing furnace. Probably sound like a broken record at this point, but pretty much the response to anything in Babylon seems to be getting killed in a pretty gruesome manner. If we move on to the next slide, right here, we can kind of just see an example of what I imagine that this kind of looks like. This is the Mansudae Hill Grand Monument in North Korea. It was built as a shrine to the King family, who really represent a kind of godlike status in North Korea as supreme leaders of their country. Visitor in North Korea, they're expected to go and bow down and leave flowers to this statue. So we're experiencing a statue right here where your religion, your leaders, and your national identity is all combined into one powerful symbol, and everybody needs to go and bow down to it. I think we can imagine what would happen if somebody in North Korea said, "No, I'm not going to bow down before your statue." When we look at North Korea, we see what happens when people combine political leadership, national identity, and religion all into one. It creates a system where human life is disposable, power is abused, and freedom is repressed. What we see in the modern world is not new, and what we read in the Bible is not out of date. Any criticism that you might make about the Kim family, I think we've seen could probably apply to King Nebuchadnezzar. By the way, those statues are only 70 feet tall, not 90. The wise men, who, if we remember, their lives were just saved a moment ago by Daniel and his companions, waste no time in ratting them out to the king. In verse 12, they state, "There are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the statue you have set up." This represents a big threat in Nebuchadnezzar's mind to his authority and his power. It sends him into a rage, and he immediately demands that these men are brought before him. In the next slide, we see Nebuchadnezzar confronts them by saying, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my God or worship the statue I've set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I've made. But if you refuse, you will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. And then what God can save you?" Well, I think we know the answer to that question. Verses 16 through 18 state, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, 'O King Nebuchadnezzar, we need not defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God who we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from our power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or the statue you have set up.'" I might expect someone in that kind of situation to say, "Well, if I'm going to get thrown into a blazing furnace, I might as well go down singing and say, 'Oh, you heathen, you blasphemer, we will never worship you.'" They don't do that. They seem remarkably polite and respectful, but also firm about their faith and what they will and will not do. You also might expect somebody to just kind of say, I'll bow down and worship him this one time so I don't get thrown into the flames, and then kind of just do what's normal. Well, no, they don't do that. Instead, they trust God, and they're just very clear about what they're going to do, trusting that God is going to deliver them from this. By refusing our bow down, our heroes are not just committing heresy and treason. They are delivering a personal insult to a man with monumental pride combined with unchecked power. As you might expect, King Nebuchadnezzar does not take it very well. We learn in verses 19 and 20 that he ordered the furnace be heated up 7 times greater than usual, its usual temperature, and the strongest men in the army bind these men and throw them into the furnace. It's pretty clear that King Nebuchadnezzar is pulling out all the stops. He wants to make absolutely sure that they have no chance of escaping his wrath. Verses 22 through 23 state, "Because the king, in his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldier as they were thrown in, as they threw the 3 men in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames." We see in this example that King Nebuchadnezzar's strongest men are just caught up in collateral damage in his rash opinion and decision to heat up the furnace to such an extreme temperature. Upon examining the furnace, King Nebuchadnezzar shouts, "I see 4 men, unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th even looks like a god." Sounds familiar? He then gets close as he can to the fire and shouts, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servant of the Most High God, come out here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, and governors, and advisors to the crown crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not even a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. Not only did they survive, they didn't even smell of smoke after being thrown into a blazing furnace. You know, if I sit behind a campfire, I'm going to need to take a shower before I can possibly go to bed. I think it's pretty clear that we already know no challenge is too big to escape God's protection, but no detail is too small either. King Nebuchadnezzar sums it up what happened pretty well. Praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own. He goes on to decree, if any people, whatever their race or nation or language, speak a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they will be torn limb from limb, and their houses will be turned into heaps of rubble. Okay. You know, love the enthusiasm. I just think God is trying to lead you out of this season of tearing people limb from limb. And worship team, if you could please come up. Our heroes, as we just saw in this story, had a very difficult line to walk. They used their skills faithfully to serve the very empire that's enslaved them. Yet when their king's demands did cross the line, they did not give in. They called out the king's idolatry right to his face. But rather than take up arms or resist their persecutor, they laid down their lives, trusting that God would save them, even in the most dangerous and powerful of infernos. Daniel believed that one day a king would come and bring liberation to his people. We know who that king is. The only person who can bring a kingdom of true freedom is Jesus Christ. Not just freedom from rulers and dictators like King Nebuchadnezzar, but from everything that enslaves us. Jesus knew that his people would face powers that would try to get them to abandon God's ways and embrace the ways of the society around them, even when that society really ran counter to God's ways. I think we can look at the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel and say, these men serve as an example for us in how we can behave in the situations like Babylon we find in our own lives. And as we walk that path of faithfulness, I don't know what challenges we're going to face. But I do know that it was Jesus Christ standing right beside those men in the furnace, and he's going to be standing right beside us as we go through our walk.